I'm standing in a Dallas courtroom, heart pounding, tearing apart my own family's firm, my dad's legacy, while he and my brother glare at me from across the room. I'm Rhea Hensley, a lawyer who fought tooth and nail for a decade, only to watch my parents hand everything to my brother, who couldn't even keep a contract straight. But here's the kicker. After I won that case, Dad showed up with an offer I never saw coming, one that could pull me back into the world I'd walked away from. Would you take a chance to fix a broken family or keep the life you built from scratch? Drop your thoughts below. I'd love to hear what you'd do. I stood across Dad's massive oak desk, my hands trembling, and realized he'd never see me as more than his little girl. It was a cool September morning in 2015, and the Hensley & Associates office buzzed around me. Phones ringing faintly down the hall, the sharp scent of leather and coffee wafting from a Starbucks cup perched on his desk. Outside, the Dallas skyline shimmered under a crisp fall sky, but inside that room, the air felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't name yet. I'd come in with my shoulders squared, heels clicking loud on the marble floor, clutching a case file I'd poured my soul into, months of late nights, cold pizza, and scribbled notes, all to prove I belonged here, right at the heart of the family firm. I set the file down gently, like an offering, and cleared my throat. "Dad, I've been thinking," I started, my voice steadier than I felt. "This case, I want it clean. The client's thrilled, and I've got ideas for the firm. I could take on more, help steer things." My fingers brushed the edge of the folder, its weight a quiet anchor. I'd stayed up past midnight perfecting it, dreaming of this moment when he'd look up and see me. Not just his daughter, but a lawyer worth betting on. He didn't even glance at the file. Instead, he leaned back in his creaky leather chair, took a slow sip of that coffee, and fixed his gray eyes on me. Cold, like the wind rattling the windows. "Rhea," he said, setting the cup down with a soft clink. "This firm's got a future, and it's Bryce's to carry. You've done real nice with that fancy degree. Harvard's nothing to sneeze at. Now find yourself a good man, settle down, make a home." His tone was flat, final, like he'd rehearsed it. Over in the corner, Bryce didn't bother hiding his grin, sprawled in a chair with his phone glowing in his hands, probably texting some buddy about last night's bar tab instead of prepping for the client meeting he'd blown off last week. I caught the smirk, that lazy tilt of his mouth, and my stomach twisted. 9 years of grinding, classrooms, courtrooms, caffeine, and here I was, still invisible. "Dad, wait," I said, stepping closer, my voice rising before I could stop it. "I didn't claw my way through law school to play house. I've got the wins, the hours, more than Bryce ever bothered with. You've seen my work. Why can't I have a real shot here?" My hands balled up at my sides, nails biting into my palms as I fought to keep steady. That's when Mom slipped in, quiet as a shadow, cradling a vase of daisies she'd picked from the garden. She moved to the sideboard, fussing with the stems, her thin fingers trembling just a touch. "Rhea, honey," she murmured, barely audible over the hum of the office. "Don't push him too hard now. He's got his way of seeing things." Her eyes flicked to me, soft and pleading, then back to those flowers, like they could smooth over the crack widening between us. I opened my mouth to argue, but Dad cut me off, his hand slamming down on that oak desk so hard the coffee cup rattled. "Enough!" he barked, voice sharp as a gavel. "Bryce is my son. This place is his birthright, Rhea, not yours. End of story." The words landed like a punch, knocking the air from my chest. I stood there, fists clenched tight, feeling the sting of my own nails digging in, a tiny private rebellion against the weight of his certainty. Bryce chuckled, a low, smug sound, and kept scrolling like I was just background noise. Mom froze. One daisy half snapped in her grip, her lips parting as if to say something, but nothing came. I couldn't breathe in that room anymore. The leather, the coffee, the polished wood, it all pressed in, suffocating. I grabbed my file, the edges crumpling under my fingers, and turned on my heel. My shoes echoed down the hall as I stormed out, past the receptionist's startled glance, past the glass doors that swung shut behind me. The cool fall air hit my face like a slap, but it didn't loosen the knot in my chest. I'd spent years chasing Dad's nod, piling up wins to stack against Bryce's laziness. Harvard law, top grades, every sleepless night. And for what? To be told my place was a kitchen, not a courtroom. Life's funny that way. You can build a tower of effort, but some folks only see the shadow it casts, not the strength it took to raise it. Out there on the sidewalk with the skyline stretching wide, I wondered if I'd ever stop running after a man who'd already picked his winner. Packing my suitcase felt like ripping out a piece of my heart, but staying hurt more. It was a quiet Sunday in the spring of 2016, and the old family house in our Dallas suburb hummed with the gentle sounds of life waking up. Birds chirping outside my bedroom window, the faint whir of a lawnmower down the street, sunlight spilling across the faded blue quilt on my bed. I stood there, 27 years old and fraying at the edges, folding a worn cotton shirt with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The air carried the sweet scent of fresh-cut grass. But all I could think about was that cold office last fall, Dad's voice slicing through me, and those daisies Mom had fussed over, wilting now in a vase downstairs, their petals drooping like they knew something was breaking here, something I couldn't mend. I was halfway through stacking a pile of sweaters when a soft knock pulled me out of my haze. Mom stood in the doorway, her graying hair pulled back loose, her eyes already glistening. "Rhea, sweetheart," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can we sit down for a minute? Just you and me?" I didn't look up, just shoved another shirt into the suitcase, the fabric crumpling under my grip. "No point, Mom," I muttered, my throat tight. "We've talked ourselves in circles. I'm done." She hovered there, clutching the edge of her cardigan, and I could feel her wanting to bridge the gap. But all I saw was her standing silent while Dad handed Bryce everything I'd worked for. Before she could answer, the door swung wide and Dad stormed in, his face flushed red under that silver hair, his tie dangling like he'd yanked it loose in a huff. "What in the world's gotten into you?" he bellowed, hands on his hips. "You're acting like a child stomping around over nothing. Where do you even think you're headed?" His voice filled the room, drowning out the birds, the calm. Out in the hall, Bryce lounged against the wall, arms crossed, a lazy grin tugging at his lips. "She's just sore she didn't get the golden ticket," he tossed out, voice dripping with that same smugness I'd heard 100 times. I snapped my head up, heat rushing to my cheeks, and caught his eye, just long enough to see he didn't even care enough to mean it. "That's enough," I said, my voice low but sharp as I zipped the suitcase shut with a quick, hard pull. I turned to face them, chin up, meeting Dad's glare head on. "I'm not throwing a fit. I'm leaving. If this family doesn't have a place for me, I'll make one somewhere else." Mom let out a small, choked sound, her hands twisting the hem of her apron so tight I thought it might tear. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she didn't move, just stood there, caught between us like always. Dad's jaw tightened, his nostrils flaring, and Bryce snorted, shaking his head like I was some kid tossing toys out of a crib. But I wasn't playing anymore. I grabbed the suitcase handle, my knuckles whitening around it, and started for the stairs. Dad's voice chased me down the hall, loud and rough. "You walk out that door, Rhea, and you'll wish you hadn't." I didn't slow down. The suitcase thumped against each step, heavy but steady, and my breath hitched as I passed the living room, those daisies sagging in their vase, a silent goodbye. I paused just long enough to snatch a faded photo from the dresser by the door, me and Mom smiling at some long-gone picnic, her arm around my shoulders. It was the one piece of this place I couldn't leave behind. Then I pushed through the front door, slamming it so hard the hinges groaned, and stepped out into the spring air. The weight of it all, Dad's words, Mom's tears, Bryce's smirk, pressed down, but I kept moving. Out in the driveway, I tossed the suitcase into my beat-up hatchback, the engine rumbling to life with a sputter. I pulled away, the quiet suburb slipping past my window, and soon the Dallas skyline rose ahead, tall and hazy through the tears I couldn't hold back. I didn't know where I was going, not yet, just that I had to keep driving, keep pushing, with nothing but a fire burning deep to prove them wrong. Sometimes you've got to let go of the roots that tangle you up, I thought, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand to find the ground where you can stand tall on your own. 7 years later, I sat at a desk that was mine until my new boss handed me the case that could destroy my family. It was a sticky summer day in 2023, the kind where Dallas heat presses against the glass walls of Carver & Co.'s downtown office, but inside, the air stayed cool, humming with the soft drone of the AC. Traffic rumbled below, a steady pulse through the streets, while I leaned back in my chair, flipping through a deposition, the faint scent of printer ink and lemon cleaner drifting around me. That old oak desk of Dad's, the one that loomed over me like a judge back in 15, felt a lifetime away now. This one, small and sleek with a single potted plant perched on the edge, was mine, earned through 7 years of grit, late-night briefs and victories that stacked up quiet and sure. But as I traced the edge of my coffee mug, I couldn't shake the feeling that a bigger fight was creeping up, one I hadn't seen coming. I was mid-sentence in my notes when Jasper Carver's voice crackled through the intercom, smooth and clipped. "Rhea, got a minute? Need you in my office." I straightened up, brushing a stray hair from my face, and grabbed my notepad. Old habits die hard. Jasper's space was a few doors down, all polished wood and wide windows, and when I stepped in, he was leaning against his desk, blue eyes sharp with that glint I'd come to know meant something big. "Take a seat," he said, gesturing to the chair with a casual flick of his hand. "You've been steady here, Rhea. Real steady. Wins piling up, clients singing your praises. I've got something special for you." His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it, like he was sizing me up. I sat, legs crossed, feeling solid for the first time in years. 34, and finally standing on ground I'd built myself. He reached behind him, picked up a thin manila folder, and slid it across the desk with a soft scrape. "Take a look," he said, folding his arms. I opened it, my fingers brushing the crisp pages, and the name hit me like a slap. Hensley and Associates v. Thompson Group. My throat tightened, a sudden knot I couldn't swallow down. Dad's firm. Bryce's little kingdom, where he'd been coasting on charm and Dad's name while I'd been out here proving myself. The file spelled it out. A contract gone south, millions lost, negligence claims piling up. I skimmed the details, dates, signatures, a mess of missed deadlines, and felt the room tilt just a little. "This is them," I said, voice low, almost to myself. Jasper nodded, watching me close. "Your old stomping ground," he said, a hint of a smile tugging at his mouth. "Thought you'd recognize it." I flipped through the pages, hands starting to shake despite my best effort to keep them still. The words blurred. Dates in 2022, Bryce's sloppy oversight glaring from the margins, and I could picture him, lounging in that office, feet up, letting it all slide. Jasper leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice dropping low. "Here's the deal, Rhea. This case, it's a beast, could put us on the map big time. And you've got the inside track, know how they think, how they move. It's a chance to shine, maybe the biggest you'll get, but it could also sink you if it goes south. Your call." His eyes locked on mine, steady and searching, and I felt the weight of it settle in my chest. I'd built this life from nothing, scratch marks and stubborn hope, but taking this meant swinging a wrecking ball at the one I'd left behind. I took a slow breath, set the file down, and met his gaze. "Count me in," I said, my voice firm even as my pulse thrummed in my ears. The decision landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading through me as I stood and shook Jasper's hand, his grip warm, confident, a quiet nod sealing the deal. I'd just locked myself into a showdown with Dad and Bryce, a courtroom clash I couldn't dodge. Back at my desk, I stared at that little plant, its leaves drooping just a touch in the heat, and let the truth sink in. I'd carved out this new world step by hard-won step, but now I'd have to face the old one head-on. Sometimes the bridges you burn light the path ahead, I thought, running a finger along the file's edge, though I wondered if this fire might leave me with nothing but ashes. As I headed out of Jasper's office, my pulse racing under the cool office lights, I couldn't help but wonder if winning this would finally make Dad see me, or just torch whatever scraps of us were left. The courtroom smelled like polished wood and tension as I stared across at Dad and Bryce, their eyes burning into me. It was a gray October day in 2024, the kind where Dallas sits under a low sky, and the courthouse felt chilly despite the crowd. Murmurs rippling through the rows, papers rustling like dry leaves. I'd walked in with my head high, the echo of my heels swallowed by the hum, and now I stood at the plaintiff's table, briefcase thudding softly as I set it down. That old oak desk from Dad's office, the one that used to tower over me like a fortress, felt reborn in the judge's bench up there, stern and unyielding. But this time, I wasn't just standing in its shadow. I was swinging back, 35 years old and ready to prove I was more than they'd ever let me be. I adjusted my blazer, smoothing the lapels with fingers that wouldn't quite settle, and glanced across the room. Dad sat ramrod straight on the defense side, his silver hair catching the dull light, his face carved from stone, 55 years of stubborn pride holding him up. Beside him, Bryce slouched in his chair, one elbow propped on the table, that same cocky smirk curling his lips like he thought this was all a game he couldn't lose. I caught his eye for a split second, and he tilted his head, a lazy challenge. My stomach flipped, but I turned away, gripping the edge of my table until my knuckles whitened. Out in the back row, Jasper Carver sat steady as ever, his calm nod a quiet lifeline. I took a breath, the faint scent of floor wax grounding me, and waited for the gavel to drop. The judge called us to order, and I stepped up first, my voice cutting through the hush. "Your Honor, Hensley and Associates dropped the ball," I began, sliding my notes into place with a steady hand. "They fumbled a multi-million-dollar contract, missed deadlines, ignored terms, and my client paid the price." I walked the jury through it, piece by piece, flipping open exhibits with crisp snaps, emails Dad had signed off on, schedules Bryce had botched. Across the room, Bryce took his turn, shuffling to the stand with a stack of papers that slipped as he spoke. "Look, we did our best," he drawled, scratching his neck. "Stuff happens, you know?" One sheet fluttered to the floor and a juror coughed, hiding a smirk. I watched him flounder, my chest tightening, not with pity, but with the slow burn of knowing I'd been right all along. Then it was my move again. I stood for the cross-examination, facing Bryce with a calm I'd pulled from somewhere deep. "So, Mr. Hensley," I said, my tone even as I paced a slow line, "you signed off on this timeline, correct?" I held up a printout, ink smudged where he'd scribbled approval. He shifted, tugging at his tie. "Yeah, sure, but—" I cut in. "And you missed 3 meetings with the client, didn't you?" His jaw twitched, sweat beading on his forehead as he stammered, "I was busy, okay?" I pressed harder, stacking fact after fact, dates, memos, a trail of laziness he couldn't dodge. The room grew still. Even the judge leaned forward a touch. I glanced at Dad just once and saw his eyes flicker. Shock, maybe a glint of something prouder, before he masked it, staring straight ahead. Bryce slumped back in his seat, papers a mess around him, and I returned to my table, heart pounding but head clear. The closing was my shot to seal it. I faced the jury, hands clasped loose, letting my voice carry. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, "Hensley and Associates didn't just fail. They chose to fail, putting pride over duty, betting on swagger instead of substance. My client deserves better." I paused, letting the words hang, and the silence stretched tight, every breath in the room held for a beat. I sat down, smoothing my skirt, and felt Mom's old pen in my pocket. Its scratched metal cool against my fingers, a small anchor while I tore down everything I'd once called home. Bryce shot me a glare, eyes narrow and hot, but Dad turned his head away, his profile sharp against the gray light. Was he furious, or was that a softer shadow crossing his face? I couldn't tell, and as the judge called a recess, I leaned back, pulse racing, wondering what I'd just set in motion. We all carry our battles, I thought, tracing that pen through the fabric, but sometimes winning feels a lot like letting go. Winning felt like a rush of air, until I saw Dad and Bryce walk out without a word. It was late November 2024, and the Carver and Company break room in Dallas glowed dim under flickering fluorescent lights, the kind that buzz just enough to keep you on edge. The air carried the warm scent of brewing coffee and sugary frosting from a tray of cupcakes someone had picked up from the bakery down on Elm Street. Outside, the skyline stretched dark and quiet, a few lights twinkling against the gray dusk of a chilly fall evening. I stood there, 35 and hollowed out, the courtroom still echoing in my head, the judge's gavel, the rustle of papers, the weight of a victory that didn't feel like one. Those daisies Mom used to fuss over back home popped into my mind, their petals drooping and gone, and I realized winning hadn't brought anything back to life. The trial had wrapped that afternoon, and the judge's voice still rang in my ears, steady and final. Judgment for the plaintiff. Hensley and Associates folded, agreeing to a settlement that made my client's eyes light up, millions back in their pocket, a clean win. I'd barely straightened my notes when Jasper clapped a hand on my shoulder, his grin wide under those sharp blue eyes. "You knocked it out of the park, Rhea," he said, his voice warm with pride as the courtroom started to empty. That was a masterclass, pure and simple. I managed a nod, my lips curving up just enough to match his, but my chest felt tight, like someone had tied a knot inside it. Dad had sat there through the ruling, his face a mask, and Bryce had slumped beside him, arms crossed, avoiding my gaze. Then they'd stood, gathered their things, and walked out, back stiff, not a glance my way. I watched them go, the door swinging shut behind them, and the rush of triumph fizzled into something sour. Back at the firm, the break room buzzed with chatter as the team gathered, passing around those cupcakes, chocolate and vanilla with little orange sprinkles, a nod to the season. "To Rhea!" someone called, lifting a paper cup of coffee and a mock toast, and the others chimed in, clapping and laughing. I leaned against the counter, nodding through a forced smile, my fingers slipping into my pocket to clutch that old photo of me and Mom, a snapshot from years ago, her arm around me, both of us grinning under a summer sun, my nails pressed into the frame, leaving tiny half-moons in the soft cardboard, and I couldn't shake the image of Dad's rigid shoulders, Bryce's empty stare. "You okay?" one of the paralegals asked, her brow creasing as she handed me a cupcake. I took it, the frosting smudging my thumb, and mumbled, "Yeah, just tired," though the truth sat heavier than I could say. Later, I slipped away to a quiet corner near the coffee machine, the chatter fading behind me. My phone buzzed in my hand, and I flipped it over, Mom's name glowing on the screen. I hesitated, then pressed it to my ear, her voice spilling out, thin and wobbly. "Rhea, honey," she said, a catch in her throat. "How could you do this to us? To your father, your brother? It's tearing us apart." I stared at the steam curling up from the coffee pot, my grip tightening on the phone until my knuckles ached. "Mom, I didn't start this," I said, my voice rougher than I meant it to be. "They made their choices. I made mine." She sighed, a shaky sound, and I could picture her twisting that apron of hers, eyes red. "I just want us whole again," she whispered. I bit my lip, cutting her off with a quiet, "I've got to go," and hung up before the ache in her words could pull me under. Out the window, the Dallas skyline loomed, steady and indifferent, and I tucked the photo back in my pocket, hiding a hurt that wouldn't budge. I was pouring a fresh cup of coffee, watching the dark liquid swirl when Jasper poked his head around the corner, his tie loosened now, his expression shifting from easy to careful. "Hey," he said, stepping closer. "You've got a visitor. Your dad's downstairs. He says he needs a word." My hand jerked, coffee sloshing over the rim, nearly slipping from my grasp as I turned to him. "Now?" I asked, voice barely steady, and he nodded, a flicker of something, concern maybe, crossing his face. I set the cup down on the counter, hands trembling despite the warmth still clinging to my fingers, and took a slow breath. After all this, the fight, the win, the silence, what could he possibly have to say? Sometimes you win the battle, I thought, brushing a crumb from my sleeve, but the war leaves you wondering what's worth saving. I grabbed my coat, the knot in my chest twisting tighter, and headed for the stairs, each step echoing with a question I wasn't sure I wanted answered. Dad stood in my office, smaller than I remembered, and said the words I'd dreamed of hearing for years. It was a crisp December evening in 2024, and my little corner at Carver & Company glowed soft under the desk lamp, the heater humming low against the chill seeping through the walls. Outside, the Dallas skyline shimmered gold in the fading light, a quiet beauty that felt miles away from the storm brewing inside me. I'd come up from the break room, still reeling from the trial's end and Mom's shaky voice on the phone, when I found him there. 55 years old, silver hair thinning, his broad shoulders hunched just a touch. Mom's old pen sat scratched and worn on my desk, its engraving glinting faintly in the lamplight, a silent thread tying me back to a past I'd fought so hard to outrun. I stopped short, breath catching as he turned to face me. He didn't sit, just lingered near the window, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his wool coat like he wasn't sure where to put them. "Rhea," he started, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it, rough around the edges. "I watched you in that courtroom. You were something else. Sharp, steady, better than I ever managed in my prime." I froze, one hand braced on the doorframe, my coat still draped over my arm. His gray eyes met mine, unguarded for once, and I saw the lines etched deep around them, years of stubbornness, maybe regret. I'd spent a decade chasing that kind of praise, imagining it in 1,000 late-night arguments with myself, but hearing it now, raw and real, knocked the air right out of me. I stepped inside, letting the door click shut, and waited, unsure what came next. He cleared his throat, a shaky sound, and took a step closer, his boots scuffing the carpet. "I got it wrong," he said, his voice cracking just enough to make my chest ache. All these years pushing Bryce to take the reins, he's not cut out for it, never was. I see that now. The firm's slipping, Rhea, and you're the one who could pull it back. Come home. It's yours if you want it. His hands stilled, dropping to his sides, and he looked at me like he was pleading, no trace of the steel I'd grown up fearing. I blinked, the words tumbling around in my head, home, mine, yours, and felt the room spin a little. This was the offer I'd once begged for, the dream that had fueled every fight, every tear, and now it sat there, heavy and real, in the space between us. I set my coat on the chair and leaned against my desk, the edge pressing into my palms as I tried to steady myself. "Dad," I said, my voice firm but quiet, "this isn't something I can just jump into. I've built something here, years of it. I need time to think." My fingers brushed Mom's pen, its cool metal grounding me while my mind raced. He nodded, slow and deliberate, his shoulders slumping a fraction more. "Fair enough," he murmured, tugging his coat tighter around him. "I'll be around. You know where to find me." He shuffled toward the door, his steps hesitant, and paused with his hand on the knob, glancing back with a look I couldn't quite read. Hope, maybe, or something sadder. Then he was gone, the quiet closing in as his footsteps faded down the hall. I sank into my chair, the heater's hum filling the silence, and let his words settle over me like a weight I wasn't ready to carry. I'd carved this life out of nothing, sweat and stubborn hope, a desk of my own, a name that stood on its own, and now Dad was dangling the past in front of me, the firm I'd once loved, the family I'd walked away from. My thumb traced the engraving on Mom's pen, to Rhea, love Mom, its familiar grooves, a piece of them I couldn't shake, no matter how far I'd run. I tipped my head back, staring at the ceiling tiles, and felt the pull of two worlds tearing at me. This one, hard-won and mine, and that one, tangled in old hurts and older dreams. You can't outrun where you come from, I thought, twirling the pen between my fingers, but choosing where you land is what makes the difference. That night, alone with the city lights glowing outside, I wondered if going back would mend us or just rip open every scar we'd tried to forget. Dad's words lingered in my office that night, soft as the winter light fading over Dallas, and I sat there, tracing Mom's pen, caught between the life I'd built and the one I'd left behind. Looking back, I see now that family isn't just about who's right or wrong. It's about finding grace to listen, even when the years have piled up walls. In this life, love can still carve a path home if we let it. I'm still figuring out what comes next, and if this story stirs something in you, maybe a memory of your own, feel free to share it below. I'd love to hear how you've mended your own bridges.